Welcome to Work Life by Design. I'm your host, Mel Marsden. If the last few years have taught us anything, it's that change is inevitable and we no longer need to go to work to work. As a workplace dynamic strategist and the founder of Community, I draw back the curtains on my own business, the clients and projects that we deliver, along with tapping into the knowledge and insights from academics, business leaders and champions of change. I believe that our environments have the power to positively influence our behaviour and performance, inspiring our human potential. This program was made possible with the support from the Alistair Swain Foundation. To find out more, go to alistair-swain-foundation.org. Establishing a strong and purposeful employee experience in your organisation can take an incredible amount of time, dedication and invested energy. So if you could find all the people, tools and resources that you needed packaged up in one little platform, backed by science and data, how much easier would that make your life as a leader and give you the confidence to know that you were giving your organisation the best possible advantage? Well, today's guest is here to tell us that this is all possible. Damon Klotz, who could arguably have the most coolest of titles, is a Work Culture Evangelist at Culture Amp. And Culture Amp are a market-leading employee experience platform. Now, I first discovered Damon and his podcast, Culture First, in the midst of the pandemic, tuning into his episode with Jen Sauer-Klein, who's an experienced designer from the States. Now, this singular episode gave me an entirely new perspective on the role of our environments, in how we influence our experiences, and how we can do that consciously through our design, adding another tool to my toolkit. Now, Jen is just among a number of incredible guests that Damon has had the opportunity to engage in conversation on his podcast. So I was incredibly happy when he agreed to join me here to learn more on what have been some of the most impactful conversations that he has had. Now, what I also learned through this episode is the diverse career that Damon has had that led him to his current role as Work Culture Evangelist. As you're going to hear, Damon is quite the overachiever. Now, prior to Culture Amp, he was leading community HR groups. He had been the global manager of digital strategy for Ramsay Healthcare. He was a keynote speaker on the future of work. And he's also the co-founder of Spur Projects, which is a social enterprise dedicated to reducing the suicide rate of men in Australia. As I said, overachiever. But what he shares is how a desire to be a sports manager and leverage the community of teams has found its way through to the work that he and the team at Culture Amp are doing. Now, in this episode, you're also going to learn more about Culture Amp and the wealth of data that they have accumulated from supporting the employee experience across numerous countries and various organizations since launching in 2009. You're going to hear how the platform supports organizations to leverage this data lake to continue to enhance the employee, the manager, and the team experience, and how taking a community-focused approach to building Culture Amp has been a key foundation in its success, growing the company from 100 to 6,500 customers, and the role that Damon played in establishing it. Plus, you're also going to hear what Damon has learned about communication, transparency, and trust from his conversations about people and culture throughout the pandemic. There were so many interesting highlights in this episode, along with some great additional listening recommendations over on the Culture First podcast, which I'll drop into the show notes, the links to those. Now, Damon also leaves us with some insights into how he has consciously continued to grow with the organisation from startup to now in all its various iterations. And it's taken a great deal of self-reflection, which he shares with us, and how we can consider our own growth mindset and the experience of comfort and what it's like to get out of our comfort zone. So without any further ado, please let me introduce you to Damon Klotz. So Damon, thank you so much for joining me today. Great to have you on the podcast with us.
No worries. Looking forward to having a great conversation.
Now, Damon, you are the Work Culture Evangelist at Culture Amp. Now, I'm going to use one of your own questions here that I have gleaned from listening into your podcast. But tell me, like I am 10 years old, what is it that you actually do at Culture Amp? And tell me a little bit more about your role.
Yeah, so probably not that many listeners have heard of a Work Culture Evangelist before. So I've been with Culture Amp since 2015, so for about 8 years now. And my role has certainly sort of changed over the course of time there. But I guess in the way I would currently kind of think about it is, you know, there's a lot of stories that we need to be kind of telling about what's possible in the world of work. And there's I think a lot of inspiration that we all need when it comes to understanding our relationship with our work and the workplace. And this role was really built to kind of have conversations about what's great about work, what's hard about work, what does it mean to be a leader these days. So I do it through hosting a podcast called Culture First. I work with our internal events team on like content programming and bringing new speakers and authors and researchers and thought leaders and emerging talent into the kind of Culture Amp ecosystem. And then there's a lot of internal work as well, just around kind of how we think about Culture Amp, the company, and what we work on, and how do we then end up positioning and branding that to the external world in a way that kind of feels authentic. So, it's part HR, part marketing, part storytelling. It's a role that I think is really unique. And I think a lot of SaaS technology companies end up getting evangelists in their kind of company at some stage, but they're typically founders. They're typically kind of, one of the founding team who ends up becoming like their chief evangelist. And Didier and the Culture Amp team built something a little bit different, where they had someone who'd been at the company for a long time but wasn't a founder, who was able to play that role. And with my background in HR, I think I bring a unique perspective to a lot of the kind of interests and struggles that comes with the world of work, which is a complex beast.
Absolutely. It sounds like you're having some pretty pertinent conversations there. And you touched on the fact that it's a little bit HR, a little bit marketing. And I know that you've had a pretty varied career history before you actually joined Culture Amp. Do you want to give us a little bit of a snapshot of what that looked like, so we can understand all of those skills that you're bringing to the table? And the fact that you're one of the original Culture Amp people, what was it that attracted you to go and to start with Culture Amp and then to be there for so long now?
It's always funny when you have to do the look back on your career, and, especially if people look at like a LinkedIn profile or whatnot, it all kind of maybe makes kind of sense. You're like, oh yeah, you did that because you wanted to do that, and then that led to that. But like, if I'm being like completely honest, it was a lot of like navigating in the dark, definitely some moonshots, trusting my gut, and kind of just trying to place myself in environments that I thought were going to be interesting and challenging. So I kind of always knew I wanted to work in some sort of like a business role, because my dad sort of worked as a sort of knowledge worker in sales organizations. And he used to have these magazines called Strategy and Business that I think were originally by Booz & Co. And I would like read them as like a kid. And I'm like, think that's kind of weird that, these like heavy kind of like academic articles, and I'm sitting there flicking through them and they're like, that guy's strange. So it started with like this interest in like, how does it all work? And then I originally actually wanted to be a sports agent. So I've always loved sport, and I've always sort of really found it like an interesting way of just how you gather people and create meaning, and like, why do people follow teams, and how much of a role does it play in your life? So then I kind of played around with that idea, and actually had a client who was a friend who was the sportsman of the year at my high school, and got him some trials at some different teams, got him some trials at AFL teams and rugby league teams. And I was sort of representing him as my only kind of client. And that was fun. And then when it came to, and this was all before I'd even sort of finished university. And when it came to, what I was studying, I ended up actually doing a business degree with HR marketing minors. And I realized that being a sports agent was kind of fun, but it was just one part of what I thought could be an interesting career. And I wanted to kind of go bigger and broader. So I went from trying to like maximize the like success of a sports person to then thinking about maximizing human potential and success through things like HR and marketing. So that was my entry point, and then was heavily involved in like the HR community in Australia from a pretty young age. So was president of the HR student group at QUT up in Brisbane, was then the convener for the young professionals group for HR for ARI, which is the Australian Human Resource Institute, and found myself at networking events. And then before I knew it, like at 19 years old, I was working in Queensland Health in a HR role in head office. And I was, really thrust in quite early into this kind of HR career. And ever since then, I think my only kind of through lines through all of my work has been about people and about technology. So who are we? Why do we do what we do? What do we work on? And then how does technology change our relationship with those things? And to weave my way to like how Culture Amp found itself into like, something I was considering, I'd already done the HR work. I was I'd done HR consulting and HR speaking. And then I found myself into marketing roles and working in like technology and marketing. And then I'd co-founded a men's mental health charity, and I experienced what it was like to kind of grow a small little startup with like no funding, and how do you make something work. And then I was introduced to Culture Amp by a friend, and they were like, oh, it's like they need a marketing style person to work at a HR tech startup. And I'm like, that's basically like everything I've ever done in my career in like one company/role. And yeah, I was like, I'd be stupid to not have the conversation. And I remember I was overseas on holiday in 2014, catching up with some friends I used to live with in London. And we were in Dubai, and then I went to Hong Kong, and I sat down and I spoke to a fortune teller, and they said that there's big changes on the horizon and that you're going to be a leader. And then like 3 months later, I joined Culture Amp. And then like 4 months later, I had moved to America. And yeah, I've been on this wild journey of 13 employees to now 1,000. So it's been an interesting career to date, one that I've always looked back and feel very fond of when I think about all the different pivots I've had to make.
Wow. What a massive overachiever you are. And to like put all these little dots together, and like I've got goosebumps listening to your story there, because it's kind of like, as you said, there's been all these little building blocks that you have kind of been touching on throughout your different career, and then you've been able to bring it all together, and you've just found like the perfect role that, you know, satisfies all of those desires that you have and the things that you're looking for in a career, but also then lets all of your skill set shine. That's pretty cool to be able to find that dream job. And the way that, and I love the fact that the fortune teller made an appearance in there as well and helped you kind of seal that deal.
I would say that like, I think I have high expectations on like what I want to work on and how I work, but I wouldn't say I'm like a traditional high achiever. And I think that's something that it took me a while to kind of navigate, because like I don't academically score very well. I, struggle with aspects of like comprehension. I was very bad at testing. I suffer from what I think is a, pretty mild to medium sort of case of dyslexia. And I had a speech pathologist as a child. So the irony that I get paid to speak and host podcasts and talk on stage, my mum never lets me live that down. She's like, I literally had to pay someone to teach you how to communicate when you're a kid. So,
paid off.
Yeah.
Works out well.
I think I'm still paying it back. So yeah, I would say that like on paper, and it might sound like it was all kind of like, shiny bells and whistles, but I think it was a lot of really navigating how to find alternative ways into a successful career that you like, because it wasn't always like I didn't test high enough to probably get into the grad program that I got into at Queensland Health to be a HR grad, but I was already working there as an admin officer, and I found that job through networking, and I proved for like 18 months I could do the work in order to become a successful grad in the program. But academically, I probably wouldn't have made the cut. So I think my career has always been finding what environment needs to be true in order to succeed, and not thinking that the traditional way to get there is necessarily the right way for me.
I think that's a really great point to be making for a lot of people. I think the education system doesn't always work the most constructively for a lot of people, and finding different ways. And the fact that you put yourself out there and you were in lots of networking groups, you were leading different sort of university communities, you were putting yourself in a position there that you were building a network that would then actually support you to create these opportunities. And one of those communities that you were creating, I mean, you were pretty integral in creating the Culture Amps community strategy, which has been a real baseline for the growth of the company. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and what some of those key foundations of that strategy were, and how that's led to the success of the company?
Yeah, so the community story is kind of, especially in the APAC region and startup APAC community, has become a little bit sort of famous in terms of Culture Amp growing in the way it did with a community strategy, which I think these days is probably a little sexier and a little bit more common. But like back then, it wasn't really something that people were kind of, thinking was a great way to necessarily grow a company, compared to traditional marketing tactics like heavy SEO, heavy kind of paid spend, ebooks and things like that.
And I think the concept of community itself is actually something that I think is only really starting to gain a lot more traction. And similarly, we rebranded in 2018 to Community as the company. And people didn't quite understand the fact that we were talking about communities as workplaces. There was this real disconnect. And I think it was only after the pandemic that people started to really realize the importance of our workplaces as communities as well. So I think you're massively ahead of the curve there.
Yeah, there certainly wasn't, there was actually an organization called CMX who was like very early on in like trying to create like an industry around community. And like I did a blog post case study for them back in 2016. And even then there wasn't that many companies to kind of learn from. But the way that it basically, like I heavily benefited from being part of communities, like I said, like from networking events where I got job opportunities that weren't being posted publicly, from gathering people in conversation and seeing my personal kind of mantra is that we're all one conversation away from changing the rest of our life. And I feel like community is one of the best ways to be in conversations that could do that. So when I joined Culture Amp, they had already, the founders, and I always say this is like, even though I was the first head of community and did a lot of the strategy and architecture of what it became, I did it on the shoulders of the giants who were the founders, who were like going and putting on events. And, they created this term called People Geek and put it on the t-shirt years before I joined the company. And what I wanted to do was take their existing interest and passion and being in conversation with people who are going to be a part of this change in the world of work that they wanted to see and how to create a better world of work. And I wanted to make it real. And I wanted to basically build the community that I wished existed when I was a practitioner, because the reality is I ended up leaving HR probably because I didn't see a lot of the inspiration that I needed in order to kind of stay in that career. Is why I ended up doing different things. So I really wanted to build the community that I wished existed when I was a practitioner. I basically built a model that's based on the Culture Amp logo, which is the Japanese enso. So if you're familiar with an enso, it's a paintbrush stroke that starts with the thickest part of the paint up top. And then as you kind of draw it down, it gets into like a light brush stroke. And the community was basically top of funnel entry at the top of the enso. So make it really easy for people to learn about it. So a newsletter, a Slack channel, social media profiles, things like that. And then as you go sort of further down the enso, you kind of get into maybe being in conversation every week in a Slack channel that we created, or attending an event series that we created called the People Geek Up, or coming to an unconference, or being part of a webinar, or speaking at an event. And then at the very bottom, you had these just huge advocates and evangelists of the company. And maybe they were customers, maybe they were just supporters. So we've ended up running thousands of events under very different brands over the years: People Geek Ups, Culture First events, unconferences, 3-day events. So that's been a huge part of it. We've also democratized access to this community through things like a free Slack channel, a weekly newsletter that's gone out every week since 2015. So I really wanted to just make sure that when it comes to conversations about the world of work, that Culture Amp was always part of it, and that it was a place where people could come and learn and be inspired, knowing that there's going to be someone like me who was going to be working in HR one day, and I wouldn't want them to maybe, leave a career that I think is really impactful and exciting because they couldn't find that inspiration that I couldn't back in the day.
And so it sounds like you've really brought all of your skills and your experience from, across those different community groups that you're in, even back to your, sports manager role there, and your concept about teams and bringing those together, and what really sort of binds people together under these common goals. They've all become part of these pillars, and you creating this community strategy.
Yeah, it's I think what's interesting about community is the diverse set of skills and talents that you need. So the first HR role that I worked in was in a corporate learning and development team, where I basically was either analyzing training notes and learning how to be a facilitator, or facilitating sessions myself. Now, doing that for like hundreds of hours means that being on stage and facilitating community conversations at events and meetups and conferences is like cool. That there's that skill set. Then there's like the planning and the logistics and the back end. There's the like scaling the community to like how do more people become part of it. And then there's like the micro side, like how does it still feel special to an individual, and what can we do to kind of surprise and delight members on any given day. And certainly one of the best things I did was hire people around me who were much smarter at me, the stuff that I was terrible at, and like give up ego and give up role and title and leveling and not really care about some of those things in order to kind of succeed. And there were certainly many members who joined over the years where I was like, that was a game changer, because they can do all this and I can't do that. And it leaves me over here to do this thing that I'm really good at. And that's how this thing grows.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point to remember, is that, you're going to have a set of skills, and you need to support yourself with those areas where you're probably not as strong, and then enable that growth to happen. And I mean, that's worked out beautifully for you and the team there at Culture Amp, because you've grown exponentially over the last few years. You've got a number of different products on the market now that support leaders and organizations to really start to enhance that culture for their organization. I think in your experience, what do you consider to be some of those most valuable insights that an organization will get from utilizing the Culture Amp platform? What are those tools that they're using, and how's that helping both individuals but also those teams?
Yeah, so, Culture Amp's success over the last sort of 10 plus years has kind of had these different sort of moments and journeys, and especially from like a product perspective about what people might expect from working with like an employee experience platform. So to kind of give you like the nuts and bolts of the original kind of product in the company, it was really built in order to replace what used to be a very outdated way of doing an engagement survey. So product one that we ended up, selling to customers was a real-time way to do engagement surveys that were in the moment with real-time insights coming in, participation rates and driver analysis, and like really working out what's going on inside of a company. Now, when we really look at the entire suite of products about like how are we working and what insights do we need, it is kind of like end-to-end visibility into the moments that matter. And it's kind of equipping people with like, what do you currently need in terms of feedback, actions, and like product, but also where is the business going? What is the future needs of your business? And like, obviously people are one of the biggest levers that you have inside of a company. So what do you need to understand about their experience? So I think the way that we kind of think about it is that there's sort of three key products that we really, help companies work with, which is the Engage product. So that's kind of, like I said, engagement surveys, science-backed with our people science team, analytics and action plans to make sure that anyone inside of like a sort of HR role who's responsible for sort of thinking about an engagement strategy knows how to really partner with us and get actions from that. The next level is probably more around development tools and building products that help sort of motivate and develop your people. So think things like development plans, career pathing, upskilling, an incredible one-on-one tool that really helps employees and managers be in sync together about what's going on and what feedback do they need and what growth opportunities are they looking for. And then kind of tying that into this sort of thing that I think for many organizations and people maybe sometimes brings this sort of shred of like dread of, which is performance, and doing it in a way that's human, that's continuous, that focuses on praise and recognition and development opportunities and is super actionable in terms of what people actually need. So when you think about all those things end to end, it really is kind of products, feedback, development, software that enhances your employee experience from the moment you join all the way to the very end when you exit, and you can provide feedback. So modern work is complex and hard. And I think there's incredible software like Culture Amp and many other tools in what I call work tech that I think are making it easier to work, giving us more insights into what matters to us and allowing us to, I guess, have a more human experience in the workplace.
And really supporting, as you said, the HR and the people and culture teams, because all the hard work's done. Like, you guys have written all of the plans, you've got all the structure there, you've got all the templates in there, which, is biggest part of the battle really when you're coming into an organization and you're trying to set all of these things up. It's already there. And I know that you guys have got researchers and analysts and people who work within your teams to make sure that you've got the best in practice there as well in terms of those toolkits. So it sounds like it's got some really great benefits, and it sounds like the suite of products has grown quite considerably to, and like you said, make it an end-to-end product.
Yeah, and certainly the value is driven at all levels of the organization, depending on how you're using the product. But I think one of the things that I'm most proud of, especially given my background in HR, is the amount of people who have partnered with Culture Amp at several companies now that they've worked at and have seen it kind of help them get promotions, get more visibility, help them have better conversations with the board and exec. And really, there's all these things that we used to kind of be like, I think this is what's happening. And it's like that weather test doesn't work anymore. You can't kind of do a gut check or like think that whether it's hot or cold in the company right now. So I think it's really legitimatized a lot of what's going on in HR. It's given people real insights and helped them have better conversations with their leaders. And like every time I hear of a story about someone who's getting promoted because they're like Culture Amp's helping them with the validation of their work, like that's always a great day.
Yeah. And I suppose that brings me to my next question, which is around the data analytics, because, you're collecting a lot of data across a lot of organizations, and perhaps you can share some of the statistics in terms of, what that spread looks like. But that's also enabling individual organizations to sort of benchmark themselves against best practice and what's happening in other organizations. So I said, as you said, it's helping sort of legitimize that. And I know that you've got in-house researchers, and I'm going to come back to that question in a minute. But how does that data that you guys are collecting actually empower those organizations to make better decisions, to enhance that organizational culture, and to utilize those benchmarks to up-level their experience for their people more broadly?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is really unique about Culture Amp is kind of we really share the like behind the scenes and like how the company's being built. And I think that's one of the biggest benefits of like working at a company like Culture Amp, and I kind of call it like my own MBA. Like I joined because I didn't want to go back to university to go do one, and I'm really learning, and I'm sharing that story because there was a meeting this morning that literally happened today, and it happens multiple times a week, called Situation Room. And it's where anyone can come in and it's, different leaders from around the organization sharing insights about how the company is being built and what's working and what's not, and what opportunities do we have, what successes do we have. And literally this morning, it was shared that over 1.1 billion pieces of data, or data, depending on where you're listening, has now flowed through the Culture Amp kind of data lake, as we call it. So in terms of the scale, we truly believe it is the biggest data set that exists in terms of the world of people and culture. So to give you just kind of the macro, that's how many different pieces of information is flowing through. To kind of make that number, which sounds ridiculous, kind of real, I'll break it down into the ways that I see this sort of data flowing through organizations. The first one is every single member of a company, and doesn't matter whether you're a 50-person company and a charity, all the way up to a multinational 100,000, 300,000 plus organization. Every single company is made up of an individual. And each individual that makes up that 1.1 billion, pieces of data has a story.
What do our workplaces look like when we no longer need to go to work? As organisations navigate a new frontier, struggling to work out what's next in today's hybrid and distributed world, how can we leverage one of our greatest assets, our workplace? My book, The Next Workplace, Designing Dynamic Environments That Inspire Human Potential, will show you how to leverage your workplace to attract and retain talent, increase employee engagement, and elevate employee experience, plus deliver bottom-line returns on your investment. The Next Workplace is the ultimate playbook. It will inspire your thinking, show you how to unlock the data in your business, provide you with the resources to build your business case with confidence, and reveal the proven frameworks and practical tools to align, enable, and inspire the human potential within your organisation. So, to grab your copy and begin to reimagine your next workplace, head over to my website, melissamarsden.com.au/book.
So whether it's the data that you're sharing about your one-on-ones, about how you're feeling, about whether you feel connected to your team, your organization, do you feel like you're getting learning opportunities right now when you're answering things like engagement surveys or diversity, equity, and inclusion surveys, or maybe even if you feel like the organization hasn't met your needs and you decide to exit, individual data exists about someone's story. And we always try to create a product where it's we really center on the individual's experience and what they're going through. The next one is the manager. We spend a huge amount of time thinking about the roles that managers play. For me, I think it's one of the most important relationships you'll have inside of an organization is between the individual and a manager. So what can we do to make a manager's life easier? I've done a lot of podcast content over the last few years about how hard it's been to be a manager and about the amount of challenges that have been thrown at them. So whether it's creating this weekly one-on-one tool that's really easy where you both log in and you'll see updates over the week, it's pulling in data from different places that then goes into a performance sync process that makes it easy for you to have those conversations. And it's not this scratch your head, what did my team do for 6 months? So what can we do to make sure that managers feel like they've got everything in their toolkit to be a better manager and to guide them to have better conversations? The next lens that most people kind of partake in is this idea of being on a team, whether it's a project-based team, whether it's a marketing team or a finance team or whatever. We then experience the world and all of this data through a team lens. So if you think about something like an engagement survey, you start filtering down and you see what teams are doing really well, why are they doing really well, what can we learn from those teams and which teams are struggling, and then how do we support both the team as a unit and then the manager as someone who's responsible for where that team's going and the goals that they're working on and whether they're performing or not. And then finally, we get to the real macro data. So think organizational level data. So things like overall engagement scores, things like, where is the company going? What is the sentiment towards leadership? What type of learnings are you getting about how, we run studies about how engagement, impacts things like share price and business performance and things like that. And that, they're the biggest business decisions that you can be kind of making in terms of whether people feel connected to the strategy, whether people trust leadership right now, or whether they feel like they really are on the same path, or has there become a disconnect between that individual team and manager and where the org actually feels like everyone's at? So whenever I think about 1.1 billion pieces of data flowing around, I'm always like, it exists at every level and every level matters in a different way. And it's a different context on how you interpret data like that.
And that's such a big number, and there's so many layers to that. But yeah, thanks for sharing that insight there, because it was actually one of your podcast episodes. You were chatting with one of your lead researchers, Freesia Jackson, and she was explaining the context of high-performing teams. And I found that episode absolutely fascinating for you guys to be able to break that apart and then understand what were some of the sort of, I suppose, the key attributes of what made a high-performing team, and how almost did a bit of myth busting on some of the things that we thought would be impactful to creating a high-performance team actually weren't, and there were other elements that were. And so that episode was completely fascinating for me, and that kind of leads me back to my question to you about your podcast, because Culture First is the podcast that you're the host of. You guys started that pre-pandemic, but I think you guys really doubled down on it during the pandemic. That's when I first found the podcast and sort of started binging on a few of those episodes there. But I suppose 3 really big standout episodes for me that I've tuned into have been the one that you did with author Priya Parker, The Art of Gathering, fantastic book, and really enjoyed that episode with her. The first one I actually found during the pandemic was the one that you did with experienced designer Jen Sauer-Klein, and I think that has been a really big transformational piece in understanding some of my own work and applying some of her concepts there as well. And of course, the one with Freesia Jackson there about the data. But I'd be really interested to know, I mean, you've had a number of episodes now. You've had the ability to talk to some pretty impressive people, Esther Perel, Simon Sinek. What has been some of the most impactful conversations that you've had on the podcast?
Yeah, it's definitely a role I don't take lightly. I've had the chance to speak to some incredible people, but it's also, I care just as much about like someone you've never heard of, who I think you should hear of, versus like someone who everyone has sort of heard of. So I think when I sort of reflect back on the journey of, we're nearly up to about 50 episodes over the last few years, and we've just been recording a brand new season that's about to come out with some new guests. And they kind of say that you should start really big projects like before you're ready, and then like look back at your early versions of it and like be okay with really messy work. And rightly or wrongly, like the biggest names I've ever had the chance to interview were like the first people I had to sit down with. And to give you some context, Culture Am has been running an event called Culture First over the last few years. It was kind of, we took these initial People Geek Ups I used to run and created like multi-day events out of it. And in order to record some of those episodes, I actually, a lot of people don't know is that they were all done on site at the conference, usually like an hour or two before these people were going on stage to give their keynote. And I was doing a lot of them back to back to back. So when you think about like, let's say you're a huge Simon Sinek fan, to interview Simon, it would probably be its own like couple of sleepless nights, and have I got the right questions, and like, is everything fine, and like, do I have lipstick on my teeth, like what's going on? And I was just like, I had no time to worry about anything.
That was probably good.
Yeah. By the end of it, I think I was like a little bit, basically it was like Simon Sinek, Esther Perel, Doreen McKesson, Claude Silver, Chip Conley, like I think 6 out of the first 10 episodes were done in this like 2-day period. And then
exhausting, because I know too, being a podcast host, like you said, the amount of effort that goes into preparing and researching, but also just the concentration that's required to conduct these interviews, like doing those back to back over a 2-day period, you must have been completely wiped by the end of it.
And it was on camera. So we all sat down next to the person, and I didn't even have my notes I didn't have paper in front of me because I didn't want to look like I didn't know what I was doing. So I was like, I basically learned every interview from scratch. I'd done I like to do crazy amounts of research on each guest to kind of make sure that there's multiple questions that they haven't had before, and that I've been able to learn something about how they work, or something that like, one of my favorite ways to sort of research guests is to find an answer that they've given before and work out what question do I need to ask about the answer they've given, as opposed to asking the same question to get the same answer. So what is it about that answer that I found interesting? So definitely the first sort of 10 set of episodes was really interesting and unique. And then the pandemic happened, and then we kind of pivoted where I did 13 episodes in 13 weeks in a series called Working Through It, where I basically became like a test dummy for what does it mean to work at the moment in the year 2020. And I was in lockdown in San Francisco. I was like in my bedroom. I had 2 roommates who were like, one worked at Apple, the other one worked in healthcare consulting, who were also at home working all day. And I'm like, shh, I'm trying to do an interview. And they're like, shh, I'm talking to China. And I'm like, we're all just like in our own little like mini company that we created in San Francisco with my friends. And And then that was kind of incredible. And then ever since then, we've been sort of building content around our Culture First events again and our virtual events. But now we're about to just bring out some new episodes that I think are really interesting and different and a little bit kind of maybe, like analyzing certain TV shows that I think are a good and a bad reflection on company culture, interviewing guests who you probably haven't heard of that you should have. I've also been able to do deep dives on companies. And I think one of the most interesting or like meaningful moments was I interviewed the CEO of a company that most people know but know nothing about, called Wilson Sporting Goods. Most families, most people, if you look at your garage, you will have something from Wilson in your, a tennis racket, a tennis ball, a basketball, something. And
the soccer ball is very famous from a certain movie.
Yes, the Wilson beach volleyball from Castaway. Yep, sorry. I was able to ask a question about that. But that CEO had never done a podcast. And so to kind of coach him on this is how it's going to go. And he cared so much about getting it right. And was it okay? So someone like Simon literally does this stuff in his sleep. And it's a great interview and I'll always be very proud of it. His book really, his books influenced me a lot. But then, someone like, the CEO of Wilson, who cared so much about trying to represent the company in the way that really mattered to his, thousands of employees. Or, I think the other thing that really stands out is I'm a straight white male who is single, who doesn't have kids and has a just incredible amount of privilege, time and resources. So I know the world does not need any more versions of that, probably hosting podcasts. So I know that Culture Amp, I feel very lucky and privileged that I do get to host it. So I always make sure that the platform needs to talk about the right things and that I need to kind of get out of the way if I'm not the right person to have the conversation, or if I am the right person to have the conversation, make sure that I'm having really, important ones. So some interviews that stand out is with Michelle Kim about how to talk about politics and race in the workplace, Minda Harts on supporting women of color at work, and then got an upcoming episode with Jamila Rizvi on how to make work really work for women. And, these are all subjects that I obviously want to learn more about. I'm not an expert in, and my role there is to really be curious, to be a generous listener, and to ask good questions in order to share these stories. So it's been an incredible journey, and it's been a huge transition for me as someone who used to do a lot of keynote talks where it was all about kind of me and my story and being funny and clicking pretty slides and telling jokes, and I knew which jokes would always land. So to kind of go from keynote speaker world, which I used to do all the time, to being in conversation and being in relationship with others and trying to have conversations that can change someone else's relationship with work. It's been a gigantic shift in how I think about my communication style, but it's been an absolute honor.
That's a really interesting reflection, because it is very different. When you are doing a keynote, you're standing up there and you're projecting out. You've already got it rehearsed. As you said, which jokes are going to land because you've tested them out. Whereas a podcast is very different. It is that conversation. And as you said, it's in that relationship and making someone feel comfortable enough to share enough and to be able to open that up, but also to be able to lead the conversation. Yeah, it's a very, very different dynamic in that. And I'll go back and I'll search out some of those podcasts that you've just recommended there as well and tune in. But I'll pop those links to those ones in the show notes so that any of our listeners can tune into that as well. But my final question around the podcast for you is, as we said, you really doubled down during the pandemic. As you said, you were recording it from your bedroom. You were experiencing, another dynamic of what lockdown looked like, living in San Francisco. And as you said, the three of you had running little mini companies from your bedrooms. I suppose, what did you learn the most about culture and about people during this time from engaging with different people in different situations through those conversations, but also about yourself living in that time as well?
Yeah, I do struggle to listen back to a lot of those episodes because I feel like I really was putting myself out there in a way that was trying to serve a goal for the listener, which was to ask hard questions about what's going on in the workplaces right now. So I had one of those sort of former highest ranking officers in the US Army kind of speak about leading in crisis and how do we lead through this time. I had a professor from NYU about what's happening inside of our brains right now. And I'm talking about what's happening inside of my brain. And it's is this normal? What's going on? And then, I think there was lots of different learnings about the need for community and conversation and how many Zoom parties and Zoom funerals and Zoom everything is this even good for us anymore? Should we be in these rooms trying to celebrate these things, or do we just need to experience loss? And how do we be more okay with loss and whatnot? So Like from a business perspective, one of the biggest learnings that I had that I think many companies probably still struggle with to this day, because it's an ongoing thing, is the balance between communication and transparency. I feel like at the start of the pandemic, I was interviewing a lot of people and hearing from a lot of companies who were thinking that more transparency and more communication was what was needed. And then when I started to do episodes really focused on like mental health and what's going on inside of, what's the reality for employees right now, and especially when you break it down based on different demographics of like early stage career professionals who would benefit from osmosis and being in person, who are now in share houses and like trying to make work versus like a C-suite member who has a spare house and a second bedroom and a study and what they're going through. So when I started to really look at how this was all changing, I realized that you need to be tailoring some of these things to the individual experience that people were having. And I think what a lot of companies defaulted to at the start of the pandemic was blanket transparency and over communication, because they were like, we've got to tell everyone what's going on. Like they're all wondering, we can't tell them in the office. And I believe it led to a huge amount of overwhelm. I think it led to a lot of anxiety. And this is not, I'm not a professor. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a trained mental health professional. I'm someone who's passionate about mental health advocacy. But what I was at least experiencing anecdotally through my conversations was a rise in some of those things. They were like, if I get one more invite to a company all hands where they tell me something that I can't control, and I think people started to reach breaking point, and we started to see these things like quiet quitting and the Great Resignation and people leaving and not even having new jobs to go to, because I think the amount of overwhelm and kind of like anticipatory grief and change that we were experiencing during that time, it was a huge kind of learning for me. And I think when I spoke to Rachel Botsman, who's a professor at the University of Oxford and one of the world's leading experts on trust, she helped me months later really work out what I was trying to understand during the pandemic. And she was like, more transparency does not equal more trust. And she has spent a lot of time really thinking about that and researching that. So I couldn't really put my finger on it in the moment, because like I said, I was literally doing it every single week and just putting it out there and seeing how it landed. It was only probably a year later when I was interviewing Rachel that I really learned that probably even to this day, people need to understand the right balance of communicating what, when, why, and to whom, and who needs to know what information at what time, and what is the right amount of transparency so that people feel like you're building a company sort of with them as opposed to them or for them, but also don't overwhelm people with stuff that has nothing to do with their job and that they can't control.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you make there, because I do think that we had this desire to kind of, like you said, over communicate and be as transparent as possible. But some people within organizations aren't equipped with understanding that transparency. Like they're finding out information about the organization that they would never have gotten that information if they were in person in the office. And then, how does that then impact them and their understanding of their job stability, or, what's going on around them, what's going to happen to their colleagues. So it adds, as you said, this other layer of overwhelm and this complexity for them that they've then got to sort of start to process. Well, there's this insecurity that happens that sort of takes them away from focusing on their actual day-to-day operations. So it's an interesting little dance that we need to do there and work out what does that all look like as we move through the different layers of the organization.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, look, one of my final questions that I have for you today, Damon, because you have been a wealth of information and I've loved chatting with you and diving deeper into your podcast episodes and learning more about Culture Amp. But, what have you done specifically for yourself to design a work life that you love?
Yeah, such a good question. And I think the word love is like important here and makes you kind of maybe answer it with a little bit more emotion and honesty than versus like what makes for like a work life that you can tolerate, or that.
Very big difference.
Exactly. So I think the first one is I check in with myself pretty often. Like I'm a very self-reflective person. I think I live in my head more than most people, probably than what's healthy too. But it's fine. I have a great therapist and great friendship circles. But I think of what makes me a deep thinker and someone who really enjoys my work is that because I do think deeply about most subjects. So I check in with myself and I ask questions and I go like, what am I working on right now? What is hard about it? What is easy about it? Am I challenged? Am I challenged in a way that feels good? Am I challenged in a way that's diminishing my energy? So I start with those kind of questions because the reality is, not many people work at a tech company that goes from startup to scale up for 8 years. Like 99% of the company has been hired after me. It's like the founders, I think 2 or 3 other people and like me. So it's like, it's not like a healthy amount of time to work at a startup. And honestly, I feel like I've worked at like 15 companies. in the last 8 years, because it was like series A, B, C, D, E, F. That's a different company. And then there's like macro moments of change or new products or an acquisition, like we've acquired some companies, or a leadership change or a team change, or, I've been like running a team and then I've gone to IC, and then there's economic pressure, pandemic. So like every single one of those is like a different company. And I always found it really healthy to check in at all of those different stages to kind of go, what's going on right now? I also feel incredibly lucky that I could probably say over half of my work days don't feel like work. And not everyone maybe wants that, or might not feel like that's possible in their world. But I'm very conscious of the trade-offs between what I work on, the value that I think I'm worth, and where the potential trade-offs occur. And it's funny because I have done well in my career, and like you said, on paper it looks like a high achiever, and culture, like I literally chose one startup and it's become a unicorn. So on paper it feels like I've made good decisions, but I've never chased money in order to try buy things that I don't need to impress people whose opinions I shouldn't be placing value on. Yeah, and I think that's a trap that a lot of people get on, is they end up not loving what they work on because they're kind of trying to do it for reasons that they shouldn't. And I'm the eldest of 4 boys, and I've got 3 younger brothers at very different kind of ages and stages, and I try to be really honest with them about how I approach my career. And we come from a pretty humble background, and I have a bit of a scarcity mindset when it comes to like wealth. So I always try to make sure that like I'm not making the decisions in order to try get things that I don't think was really important. So I think the other thing that I might want to reflect on is kind of like, I'm in my sort of early to mid 30s now. And I think the other part of designing a work life that you love is to sort of think about the chapters of a book, and whether you actually write a book about your life or whether you just want to reflect on it. I always think back at like, what am I writing at this stage? And like, what am I proud of? And if I look back at the previous chapters, what was going on? And when I look back, I'm like, I'm really glad that I traveled a lot when I was young. And even though I had to work really hard to kind of get money to do it, to get to 45 countries by age 24, and then to move to America in my mid-20s when I was willing to, like I said, have roommates and be humble and like go on that journey of I went from a 35,000 person company to like a 13 person startup. Doing that early on, challenging myself and like really pushing myself into those kind of environments, because I'm a huge believer in we're shaped by our environment. So I think find ways to be in environments that you love. Don't just think about the work. Don't think about the role or the company. Like, what is it about the entire environment, and whether it's travel, the industry, where you work? Because like I always look back and I'm like, I don't know if I could do a lot of the things I did at this stage. Would I be willing to travel as much and as often in the way that I did when I'm older? Probably not. Would I be willing to become an expat again under the circumstances? So I always look back and go, I love what I do because I've always tried to find ways to like be in the moment of that chapter, to think about the entirety of who I am and what I work on, and how does this help get me somewhere, and what am I really thinking about? So yeah, I'm in a different stage now. I'm kind of slowing down. I'm trying to balance a few different things. I've settled back into life in Australia after 8 years overseas as an expat, and I'm thinking about different sort of stages and phases, and I'm excited about what's going on. But as long as I'm feeling healthy about the chapter that I'm writing, about why I love what I'm doing and which parts are hard, and never kind of getting too caught up in the highs and never getting too low on the lows, I always feel like I'll have a pretty healthy relationship with what I work on.
Oh, what incredible insights, and such self-awareness there too, Damon, like to take that time back and reflect on those different points. And like you said, to have been at a startup for so long and through all those iterations, as you said, most people, as the organization grows, it either outgrows them or they outgrow the company and they need different skill sets. But you've kind of molded and adapted yourself to continue to check in and go, is this the right place for me? And then to consciously make that decision to stay on and in that role and change that and grow with that. But there's also some interesting things that you mentioned there about that growth mindset and the ability to put yourself outside of your comfort zone and consciously decide whether or not this is challenging you for the right reasons or the wrong reasons, and then to continue to put yourself in that situation. There's some pretty interesting little self-reflections in that, and some great advice for anyone who's listening in terms of doing your own check-ins.
Like I said, I'm not sure it's as healthy as possible to live in your head as often as I do, and to reflect on every little thing and be like, remember this day on this year, and like how this like, but that's just kind of like who I am. Like I'm very much like a in the present kind of person. I truly believe that like all we really have is the moment that we're in, and you've got to be okay with kind of like, this is what it is. And I think the same goes for like my advice about how to create a really great employee experience is also like, don't really like focus on strategy and the big things and whatnot. But at the end of the day, our experience at work is just made up of like little moments. How does someone treat you? What do they say to you? Do you feel like they care? Do they recognize you? And like the events we used to run, I would always be the person who, like, before we'd like, run a meetup in like Los Angeles, we're at the Jessica Alba's company, the Honest Company, hundreds of people coming in from all over LA for our first event there. And I made sure the team stopped and we sat and looked over the Hollywood Hills and was like, we get to do this. How cool is this? I know it's hard. I know the build-up can be hard. I know in the event it can be hard. I know the follow-up it can be, there's lots of stuff. But let's just like, we get to do this. And I think if you can love the hard moments and the good moments and just sort of be present in what makes it, so I think that's healthy. And maybe sometimes you can reframe your relationship to your work, when I think a lot of people go find other companies because they feel like that there's something missing. And maybe if you have a more edgier conversation with your current experience in your workplace, there might be, and I'm not saying always, but this is actually, if you listen to the Esther Perel episode, or something that she said to me in one of the first moments is, can we have a new relationship with our current workplace? Or do we throw it out hoping that we find a better partner or a better company? So I think, let's just stay in conversation about our experience with love and work and work out what matters to us. And as long as you feel good about your own drivers and motivators, I always feel like that's a pretty healthy place to be.
Awesome. Look, thank you so much, Damon. You've been a wealth of information today. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to find out more about you and more about Culture Amp and the podcast?
Yeah, so I'm lucky that I've got a bit of a strange first name and last name, so not too many Damon Klotzes running around in the world. So I'm just at DamonKlotz on all social media platforms. So if you want to follow me on those, you can send me a message on LinkedIn. I share some sort of content from the podcast on my Instagram as well. By the time you're listening to this, new episodes of the Culture First podcast will be dropping, including some sort of behind the scenes, never heard before content with both Esther and Simon. So you can go to cultureamp.com/podcast and then look it up on Spotify and Apple, give it a follow, give it a review, give it a 5 stars, do all the things that podcasters have to tell you to do. Otherwise, our podcast don't exist.
Exactly. Thank you. Great plug there, Damon. And look, again, thank you so much for joining me today. I really, really enjoyed this conversation and, getting deeper into what it is that Culture Amp do and how you guys are really supporting organizations to change that employee experience, because I think it's really important for us to be doing that holistically. So thank you.
No, and thank you for doing the work that you do and creating a platform for people to have conversations about work and place and our relationship with it. Because like I said, the environment matters. Where you physically are, the type of conversations that you're having. So big kudos to you for using your voice and company and platform in order to have conversations like this, where we can have that honest conversation about where, how, why of work and how do we make it better.
Oh, thanks, Damon. I love it. So it's another one of those things where I don't feel like it's actually working. So it's awesome. Thanks very much, Damon.
No worries. Thank you.